One piece of advice we probably all heard is that yeast should be pitched into well-aerated wort. So what's the best way to do it? We're looking at the results of 4 experiments, ranging from the shake method to various ways to use pure O2, and of course we can't forget about olive oil at yeast pitch. Yeah, that's a real experiment. What will the results tell us? Let's find out. This episode is sponsored by Morbeer. More on them in a bit. The science is clear. Yeast use the oxygen during fermentation for the synthesis of sterols and unsaturated fatty acids, which facilitates cell membrane health and reproduction. Obviously. But here at Brülosophy, what we wanted to test is the perceptible impact of various methods of aeration imparted on a finished beer. And the first experiment looks at the tried and tested shake method. Now, many yeast labs recommend adding 8 to 10 parts per million of oxygen to wort, and shaking alone is purported to be able to reach the lower end of this range if you put in some considerable effort. And fortunately for us, former Brülosophy contributor Ray found is a self-confessed carboy shaker. Ray created an experiment to evaluate the differences between a beer aerated by shaking and one made from the same wort with no effort put into aeration. And for that, he brewed a large batch of American IPA, holding a mash temperature of 150 Fahrenheit or 66 C, using some high-tech equipment. After the boil and hop additions, the wort was chilled and ready for racking. And note that the beer was quite strong, clocking in at around 1.070, so there'd be plenty for the yeast to chew through. Now, both carboys were gently filled from the bottom up using a long transfer hose. Then, as Ray describes it, the non-aerated batch was daintily moved to his fermentation chamber, and then he proceeded to shake the living hell out of the other carboy for 3 minutes. Yeast was then pitched into both batches. A few weeks later, both beers had attenuated to an identical 1.016 Fg when corrected for temperature, and were ready to serve to tasters. Now, apparently these beers were quite good, because by the time Ray got to serving the beers to tasters, there was only enough for 7 participants before the kegs kicked. But what did they report? Well, participants received 2 samples from the aerated batch and 1 from the non-aerated batch, and were then asked to select the one they perceived as being different. A total of 5 tasters would have had to accurately identify the unique sample to imply statistical significance, but only 1 solitary participant was able to do so. And in his semi-blind tests, Ray was unable to tell the beers apart either. In this single data point, with a small sample size, I'll give you that, well, the shaking, it didn't have a perceptible impact this time. Now, I've used the shake method myself many times when I fermented in carboys, but it does present a few challenges, like just how much shaking is actually required to add the proper amount of oxygen to the wort. And also, this method relies on dissolving air from the immediate environment into a liquid later to be ingested. So just how pure and clean is my ambient air anyways? Well, the obvious alternative to this is to add a measured amount of pure O2 into the wort. So to test this, former Brülosophy contributor Greg Foster designed an experiment to evaluate the differences between shake aeration and the use of pure oxygen on a split batch of cream ale. After brewing, the wort was distributed into 2 kegs for fermentation. Now, Greg outsourced the shake method batch to a friend who, in his words, shook the living crap out of the keg for a solid 90 seconds. Meanwhile, Greg chose the much less physically demanding route and prepared the pure O2 batch by dropping in a tube with a 0.5 micron stone, opening a regulator valve to a tank of pure O2, then waiting 2 minutes. At the end of fermentation, both batches reached a similar final gravity of 1.012 and were served to 21 members of the Pacific Gravity Homebrew Club. Participants received 2 samples from the shake aeration batch and 1 sample from the pure O2 batch, then were asked to select the odd beer out. 12 tasters would need to accurately select the different beer in the triangle test to reach statistical significance, but only 9 did, and Greg was also unable to distinguish the beers. But for fun, Greg asked participants one additional question before revealing the results, and that was how confident they were in their answer. And amusingly, this data appears to indicate an inverse relationship between level of confidence and likelihood of being dead wrong. Killed by confidence. Now, this was a cream ale with a starting gravity of only 1.053. Would the outcome have been different in a higher OG beer? Maybe so. Well, a high OG beer is the topic of our next experiment, but before we get to that, a quick word on today's sponsor, More Beer. More Beer's slogan is absolutely everything for homebrewing, and it's easy to see why, given their selection of over 8,000 products. Like the Brübuilt X3 Uniconical Stainless Steel Fermenter, or the Cosmos series of kegerators that give you everything you need to get started with dispensing and serving your homebrew. And for quality fermentations, More Beer carries cellar science, yeast and nutrients. More Beer offer free shipping on most orders over $59, and also be sure to check out their killer YouTube channel featuring brewing tips, hijinks and incredible giveaways. Check out everything More Beer has to offer at morebeer.com. Now, in the book Yeast, the Practical Guide to Beer Fermentation, the authors recommend that for beers with a strength of 1.083 OG or higher, a second dose of oxygen be added after 12 to 18 hours, and that may result not only in faster fermentation and higher attenuation, but also in reduced risk of diacetyl and acetaldehyde. Purportedly, the yeast cells undergo at least one cell division during the time between those two oxygen doses. So, former Brülosophy contributor Matt Del Fiacco designed an experiment to evaluate the differences between an imperial stout dosed only at yeast pitch and one dosed at both yeast pitch and a day into fermentation. So, single dose versus double dose of O2. Matt set about brewing 2 batches, mashing at 154 Fahrenheit or 68°C for 60 minutes. After adding hops, the worts were then boiled for 60 minutes and both reached a lofty gravity of 1.123 OG. Well done, Matt. Now, the worts were transferred to fermentation kegs and were both hit with 60 seconds of pure oxygen before pitching a yeast starter into each batch. The fermentation kegs were placed next to each other in a temperature-controlled chamber, and 18 hours later, Matt gently removed the lid on one keg and proceeded to dose it with another 60 seconds of pure oxygen. 2 weeks later, hydrometer measurements were taken and they showed a notable difference. So 1.021 Fg for the single dose of oxygen batch and 1.017 Fg for the double dose batch. It would appear that the additional dose of oxygen led to a more fully attenuated beer. The beers were then pressure transferred to sanitized serving kegs and a few weeks later were ready for evaluation. A total of 22 people participated in the triangle test, where each participant was served 1 sample of the beer dosed once with oxygen and 2 samples of the beer dosed twice. At this sample size, 12 tasters would have had to identify the unique sample in order to reach statistical significance, but only 9 did, and in his 7 semi-blind tests, Matt chose the unique sample just twice. Actually, Matt described both beers as clean, with prominent bitter chocolate and roasted coffee character, and despite the high ABV, he didn't detect any alcohol warmth from either. So on a sensory level, the beers were indistinguishable to most tasters, but there was a measurable difference of 4 gravity points in attenuation, which, well, it makes me think about the impact this would have in less favourable conditions. So, for example, what if the yeast pitch rate had been too low? If there weren't enough viable yeast cells that had been added into the wort? Could double dosing of O2 have assisted the yeast properly complete fermentation in that case? Maybe so, something to think about for future brews. Okay, now adding any amount of oxygen to wort is going to bring fears of potential beer oxidation further down the line. Which brings us to an interesting study in 2005 by a graduate student, Grady Hull, who hypothesized that adding, of all things, olive oil to yeast during storage could eliminate the need for standard aeration, as the yeast would theoretically take up the unsaturated fatty acids needed for cell wall development. We simply had to try this for ourselves. So, Brülosophy contributor Cade Job designed an experiment to evaluate the differences between beers fermented with and without a small amount of olive oil added at yeast pitch. Now, he brewed a large batch of Kolsch, then prepared the variable, 8 milliliters of extra virgin olive oil. That's in line with the recommended dosage rate in the academic paper of 1 milligram per 25 billion yeast cells. Then, with the beer split between 2 fermenters, Cade added the oil to one of the batches before pitching his yeast. A gravity reading a few weeks later showed no difference in Fg, with both batches at 1.003. Visually, well, the beers look much the same as well. Now, 21 participants took our triangle test, where each participant was served 2 samples of the beer fermented with olive oil and 1 sample without, and asked to identify the unique sample. For statistical significance, we needed 11 tasters to accurately identify the unique sample, and, come on, this time, no, only 5 participants did. They were unable to reliably distinguish the beers. Rats. In Cade's own testing, he identified the odd one out only twice in 5 attempts, and he said the beers looked, tasted and smelled exactly the same, and there was certainly no olive oil flavour either. So what do we take from 4 wort aeration experiments, all coming back as non-significant? Well, firstly, non-significant does not equal no difference. There could have been sensory differences that some tasters were able to pick up on while others were not. Also, these are single data points with different beer styles and different brewing methods and different yeast varieties. The results might come out differently. But what I take away from this is if you pitch an appropriate amount of viable yeast, like the 200 billion cells in an imperial yeast pouch, in many cases fermentation is going to go just fine. And in fact, despite owning several wort aeration stones and pure oxygen tanks myself, I find I very rarely use them because I just haven't seen a benefit in doing so. But what about you? Has wort aeration had a noticeable impact in your brewing? Let me know in the comments. Oh, and if you think that olive oil is a bit of an unusual addition to beer, you should see some of the other things Cade is up to in the name of brewing science, like the 3 things he covers in this video here.